Well, hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I'm Alex Beene, a contributor with the music site 360degreesound.com, where we bring you music from all angles. For this installment of our long-running Author Talk series, I'm really pleased to be joined by Cleveland-based music journalist Annie Zaleski, who's the author of this great new book, Beyonce, The Stories Behind the Songs. And I'm so happy that you're here with us today, Annie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to get into this because
Mhm.
I think that a lot of chatter recently has been, obviously, during the Cowboy Carter era, about her breaking down the lines of different musical genres. And the one thing
Mhm.
that really stood out to me going through your book is she's been doing this for a long time. This is nothing new. What were the takeaways you took going through the eras with her about her being a pioneer in so many ways?
I love this question because you're 100% right. And the most fascinating thing I think for me is because I've been following Beyonce since Destiny's Child. I was the person watching TRL in the late 90s, watching, Beyonce. And so I've really seen her grow up. And what struck me is that I mean, because everyone knows her singles, right? But when you do dig into her actual albums, the breadth and depth of the genres she covers are incredible. Like it is, you're right that she's always, she's never been just one thing. I think people categorize her as sort of R&B or soul or hip hop, for lack of a better category, but she's always sort of followed her muse and whatever she sort of wants to be at that given time. Obviously she has a gospel influence. There's a little bit of funk here and there. There's rock and roll. And obviously more in recent years, techno and dance music as well. But she really always has, kind of marched to the beat of her own drummer and is a real visionary in that sense. And I don't think she necessarily gets the credit for that. Obviously, she's a massive superstar and headline stadiums. But when you really look at her catalog and what she's produced, it was so striking to me that she should be considered, like someone like Nina Simone and, Aretha Franklin, and in terms of the greats, in terms of just how versatile she is.
Do you think we see so much? In fact, there was just a Rolling Stone listing out of top singles for the last 25 some odd years, and Crazy in Love was near the top of it.
Mm.
Is that the turning point for her? It sure feels that way in terms of singles, because like you said, Destiny's Child, it's hard when you're in a group that prominent to break out. Was that
Mhm.
the moment, or where do you think was the moment where she arrived as a solo artist?
I feel like she's had many times when she's arrived as a solo artist, honestly. I think Crazy in Love was definitely the first one. And, when you read about sort of how that song came together, it was so striking for its time. It was kind of using an old school retro sample. And no, I mean, today everyone does that. That's something very common. But when that song came out, it was so different. I think that song really kind of, she showed everyone I can operate on my own. I'm coming out of the gate as a solo artist. And, she had some songs before that, but that was really like I can stand on my own. I feel like when she's gotten kind of when she started really doing visual albums as well, I think that was another major turning point. You see, especially when she starts releasing her self-titled record and then Lemonade, that the way that she was kind of looking at her art changed. I think early in her career, she was trying to prove herself commercially, like on the charts. So there was definitely the big singles that were going to be, that were aiming for radio airplay and things like that. And she's really viewed her albums as projects and a kind of very ambitious sort of mix of cinema and sonics as well, storytelling, as the more her career has progressed. And so I feel like you see that because that just, and if she's kind of continue that, I would think, is that she is just, songs, obviously her albums will be commercially successful, people will stream and buy them, but especially now she's following her muse and she's creating works of art, basically, as she's doing things.
One thing that I love that your book does, I mean, and if you're a Beyonce fan, you have to get the book. I just want to say that right off the bat
Thank
because
you.
any book that goes into literally Worldwide Woman, which I thought I was the only person left who remembered that on a deluxe edition of B-Day, but it goes into all of the singles. One thing, to your point, I'm so glad you brought that up on the theatrical side and the
Mhm.
cinematic side. So she has that era in the mid to late 2000s where she does big budget movies. She does Dreamgirls. She gets a Golden Globe nomination. Do you think that had an impact? Because to your point, it's kind of after that point she does start thinking about more visual based albums.
That's a really great point because I think that's absolutely true. I think, she had as I dug up in the book, she had all sorts of, kind of obscure acting um forays, I guess, before kind of really, getting, working hard and becoming and getting nominated for some of her roles. But she talked about, how portraying Etta James as an example really changed her. And, some of the other, I think it was Dreamgirls, where it was such an intense experience that she basically was like right after I had to go in the studio by myself. And so I think that, as a creative person, I think all that stuff feeds her, and I think, but you see in the visual albums, I mean, they're so sometimes artists put out a visual album and it's like, well, here's just a collection of videos or here's a concert film. They'll just kind of drop it out there. But the way that the music and the visuals fed off of each other and were really kind of inextricable from each other is, I think, really striking, because it was basically like, well, what came first, the music or the movie? And everything was so well thought out and carefully put together that it's like they are mini movies, in terms of that. She was making kind of cinematic movie soundtracks. And I think as she grew more confident as an actress as well, I think that says a lot because, early on she talked about how, she was a little bit out of her element. But, the more and more she did that, though, she really, as a good Virgo, I'm a Virgo as well. So I appreciate her work ethic. And you could see as she was really working hard on her craft, it really infused her music. A lot of artists still view kind of their movie careers and music careers as separate. And I do think that that for her, that really feeds off of one another in a really wonderful way.
You brought up obviously with that the very first primarily visual album she did, the self-titled album in 2013. She shadow drops this on a Friday,
Yeah.
and it was a big deal. And I wonder in your analysis of this, do you think, because I think at the time we all felt as if she was trying, and with Lemonade, she was trying to bring back the album as opposed to the
Hmm.
single. Did you take that away from it, or what do you? Because that was a very gutsy move at the time. You don't just drop a full album on Friday. People don't realize that today.
Well, and that's just it. She dropped a full album and visuals with, interesting collaborators. I mean, she worked with someone like Boots, who was absolutely unknown at the time. Carolyn Polachek's on that record. It was such a step forward for her because the music, especially, it was almost like it was sculpted from different things. There's so many interesting samples and how everything is put together. Um, and no, and that was, 100% in terms of when you were kind of looking at, when you mentioned turning points earlier, I think that absolutely is a turning point. And I think what's fascinating about that record is that that really does sort of strike the balance of artistry and maybe chart success. Like obviously Drunken Love, and Pretty Hurts were massive songs for her, absolutely massive, and are sort of, two of her signature songs. But there are other songs that are really, to tell the whole story of the record, though, you have to have other things then. And so it is really interesting. And and I think too, Blue Ivy's on the record as well. So it was a very interesting sort of pivot point where she's kind of, talking about marriage and kids, but then also who she is as a person and things like that. And really kind of coming into her own. I think so if that came out in what, in 2013, is
Yeah,
that right? Yeah, 2013.
December 3rd.
So I mean, yeah, she was kind of in her early 30s. And I mean, that's a very, I think pivotal time for people as well. And she was really, comfortable in what she had done previously. And it's like, yeah, let's, if songs become a single, become hits, great. But the overall element and the overall record and album and how they fit into that context is more important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, Speaking of that, I've been very fascinated with the last 10 to 15 years of her career. To your
Me too.
point, we were talking about earlier, obviously, this is a book about individual songs and the stories behind them. But it seems like with that pivot, with that album, she moved away from the single, which is pretty big
Absolutely.
in our culture. Um, do you see? I think some people debate the positives and negatives of that. It's important to note that since that time, she hasn't had as many singles that have charted, interestingly enough.
Hmm.
Do you think that pivot was worth it at the end of the day? Do you think she cares? I kind of wonder if she even cares about it.
I feel like, I mean, I think on some level she cares. I mean, if you look at Cowboy Carter, it was introduced by, Texas Hold'em, which obviously was absolutely huge and, was a number one single globally, made the charts. And so you can tell a song, especially like that. And I think that that spoke to the fact that she wanted to say a Black woman could have a country hit. And so you can kind of see how that sort of goes. But I think in general, I don't know if she cares about having singles anymore. Speaking to the point of, she had hit singles, she had number one hits, she had, like top 10 hits, for many, many years. Yeah, but with Destiny's Child as a solo artist, she was dominant. And you're right, in the last decade or so, you can kind of see either her collaborators, the music she's made, and also kind of her career, like artistic choices. They've been following things that are important to her. I mean, obviously, both politically and I think socially, there's definitely, she's like, I have this massive platform. How can I make art that moves the needle? And that was very striking when I was putting together the book and looking at everything she did. And what also really struck me is how deliberate it is and how authentic all of that stuff is. Like when you look at Renaissance, for example, and the artists she's worked with, like she put her money where her mouth is. She's working with trans artists, she's working with queer artists. She went to the source for some of the artists who were big in ballroom. She knew, and her collaborators knew, these are the voices we need in there. Let's elevate them. And so she's also really, really great at, lifting up other artists in a way that I think she maybe doesn't get enough credit for. We saw that on Cowboy Carter as well, with, the way she had Linda Martell on there, and of course Dolly and Willie, but then also some of the younger artists who have followed in her footsteps. So it's really, really striking, and it's really subtle. And I think that's the other big thing, is that because she doesn't have these massive hits, everything she's doing is a lot more subtle and nuanced. And that makes it a lot richer, I think, and deeper to listen to.
So this is the part when we moving ahead to Lemonade, and this is
Yes.
the era that I'm so into because it is an incredible era, and it's
Yes.
arguably one of the most controversial Grammy Best Album losses ever for an artist.
You know.
Um, I have a theory about this, and I want to bounce this off at you.
Okay.
But Madonna, obviously, Beyonce's taken a lot of inspiration for her. She referenced her on Renaissance quite a bit.
Hmm.
Who was the precursor to the big female pop star. Madonna, obviously coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, used sex a lot to grab attention.
Hmm.
By the mid 2010s, that doesn't really generate the same amount of attention as it once did because it's everywhere. Do you feel like a lot of that album, which I love, but it's very much guarded in the idea that there could be affairs going on in the Carter household, and it's kind of playing on that. Do you think that was her way of kind of replicating the same type of generating that type of buzz that was there? Because it seems like now today we kind of look back on it and laugh, but at the time it was a real topic of controversy. Was Jay-Z
Absolutely.
cheating on her? Like, what were your thoughts revisiting all that?
So I think the funniest thing in terms of revisiting that is when, I actually, when you look at the songs, some of the songs, and I'm sorry it's escaping me because there are so many Beyonce songs, but one of the songwriters was, no, this was not about cheating. I wrote this about having issues with the label, which was fascinating to me because you're right. At the time, all the conversation was Jay-Z is cheating. And, she's never really come out and said that. And I think that's what's very interesting about it is that, I think we all sort of assume when we have all these songs out, they're autobiographical. I think that's always the assumption from people. That's the kind of the default. And, I think because Beyonce has written so many very personal songs over the years. So you can, it's safe to say, okay, this is what we're talking about here. But she's never really come out and said that. And I think that's really fascinating because maybe at the time, there's different characters that are involved, and she's been known to use characters before. So, it's interesting. It's never, you're never quite sure if that actually is Beyonce. Is that what she's thinking about? Are those are her worries, her anxieties? It is really fascinating. And I think that it is one of those records when you go back and listen to it, you're like, but at the same time, it's like, she's what she's describing, from the betrayal to, the reconciliation, did that actually happen? Is this lightly fictional? I don't know. And I think that's what's so fascinating about it is that, she doesn't get people don't necessarily, I don't think people pay attention to her songwriting enough. Let's put it that way. And that was part of the fun, I think, of really just doing this book, is to be able to really dig into it and show why is she is such a unique figure. And so I think that's why we're still talking about this record, because like I don't know. It's a good question. The Madonna comparison I think is really interesting because Madonna did a very similar thing in that she had this, her early music was definitely focused on one thing, and she evolved to become way more sophisticated and have these more overall sort of artistic elements rather than going for hit singles as well. And, it's a freedom to be able to do that.
It
No pun
absolutely is.
intended, actually.
Yeah, 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 and you have to be at a certain level to get away with that, right? And most
Right.
artists they're looking to cash in on that single. This is also the era where I think she makes a very strong political statement through her music, as
Yes.
you said. And I don't even know if I would go so far as political, but maybe like a social political
Hmm.
statement in it. And there's the grand performance that she makes at the Super Bowl that year with Bruno Mars. Of course, that was during the time with Colin Kaepernick and other things going on.
Hmm.
Um, I'm fascinated by this as well because I don't know how in the weeds she wants to get politically. Like I know she's done speeches,
Hmm.
but is it one of those things you were kind of saying earlier about she doesn't really tell us the story? We kind of gave on to.
Yeah.
Do you think that a lot of the political divide on her starting with this era speaks more to America in general than it does to her? Because I don't get like I get the sense that she cares about it, but I don't think she's one of these people who's wanting to come out getting political all the time on everything. Or I don't know if she sees it as political.
It's interesting because, I mean, the formation at the Super Bowl was so astounding. I mean, first off, I always forget that she didn't headline because,
Yeah.
oh, that's right, Bruno Mars was also there. It was
Yep.
such a stunning performance. And I do think that she is more political than people give her credit for. Obviously she's, endorsed politicians, and she's shown up in different places over the years, and obviously freedom was Kamala Harris's theme. And so I think a lot of behind the scenes stuff, like many stars, she's doing that. I think that she's really poured in terms of the her kind of political statements or socio-political statements into her music. I mean, it's terrible to say in 2025 that making a making a country, you're being a Black woman making a country record is a political statement. But when you look at what else is on the charts, it's, it's she, was like the only one. And as her trying to, like I said before, lift up people. And the same thing with like Renaissance. It's almost like, in The Lion King as well. She worked with a lot of African musicians, like really, really interesting Afropop artists as well. And, really kind of did it right and realized this was something that's really important to me. And so it feels like she's sort of telling us what she wants to do through her music. And just like I guess it's walking the walk in a sense, and maybe the actions speak louder than words. That's the sense I've always gotten from her. Because I think, when you look at like pop stars who are being outspoken, there aren't that many, I think in general. I don't think she's necessarily alone in that she's not being overtly political. I mean, Pink obviously is, and we as who of course, and but she's, I think, always been like that. She's even from kind of a younger artist. So it's an interesting question. And I think especially now because, taking a stance and being political is so fraught in today. And, thinking about like if someone did Formation today, I think the reaction to it would be so incredibly different than it was a decade ago.
Yeah,
And,
I agree.
and maybe not necessarily in a welcome sort of way. So, which is, and like I count Formation and also her Coachella performance as two of like the greatest sort of, like large scale performances of all time, honestly. They're just both stunning.
Leading up to today, I mean, obviously we've got a few. I don't know how you felt going through it, but the Renaissance era, when it first happened, I was, and this will shock some people. I was kind of, I was like, well, she's done better
Interesting.
stuff. Like Lemonade was a better. I felt like her last two albums were better, and then I went to see her on tour. She came to Nashville for it, and went back and re-listened. I was like, holy smokes, this is
Uh-huh.
really good. Um, I think one thing in revisiting this and then listening to many of the ones you did was I'm kind of shocked by how well everything holds up because a lot of pop
Yes.
music, well, I don't say just hers, it obviously falls out of that category, but like most modern music doesn't hold up even, 5 years afterwards. Do you think that's part of it too? Just her genius is in the fact that she's somehow been able to craft stuff that still feels relatively timeless?
Oh, 100%, 100,000%. And, and I think that's the thing that people sort of, almost not take it for granted exactly, but just when you look at her records, because they, you know, as we mentioned at the start, aren't necessarily one specific thing and, just R&B or just soul. The fact that they do sort of nod to different eras and the production has aged incredibly well, honestly, on most of her solo stuff. And the fact that she is, making this record and, making records and following her muse 100%. I mean, her music, and that's why when people talk about her, I'm like, why isn't she considered, at what point are we going to consider her one of the greats? Because she is great. And she is all of the music she's made over the last 25 years has absolutely held up. And I think, yeah, Renaissance, especially like when, I listened to it, of course, and I liked it. But when I was really digging into it for the book and looking at, like I said, who she was working with, the songs, the samples, and how everything flowed together, it's like, this is a brilliant record. This was a pop record. Like it was so different and so thoughtful and so deliberate in a way that was very natural. And so I think it was just, yeah, I think it was just really, really aged well and could be translated to the stage. And I think that's the other thing too, is that we haven't even talked about the, just her as a live performer as well. Um, and how she kind of weaves her different eras together. And you can almost, and that's another testament, I think, to how the albums have held up, that she's able to say, well, I have this song from 2024, but this calls back to something from a decade ago, and maybe something before that. And it all really kind of flows together in really interesting and intriguing ways.
And she can, to your point, absolutely tie them all together in
Hmm.
a her tours or like theatrical
Yep.
productions. Do we want to get into the whole country controversy? Because I'm just so exhausted. This has been a thing, obviously, for the last year and a half.
It's
What do you make
so
of it?
tiring. And I mean, and honestly, it almost goes back a decade when, she performed with the Chicks and everyone, completely lost their minds because she was collaborating. Then the Grammys were like, we are not nominating you. And it's so, I mean, first off, it's so insulting to her as someone who grew up in Texas and will sit there and be like, yeah, I went to the Houston Rodeo growing up all the time. I saw Willie Nelson. I saw all sorts of artists. I soaked up all of these different influences. And it's also so insulting and frankly racist to basically be like, you're a black woman, you can't do country music. And when you listen to her, and Cowboy Carter is also such an interesting record because that's definitely, it's because people say it's a country record, but like all of her records, there's all sorts of different references. Obviously, there's gospel, which pairs very well with country. There's soul. She takes the Beatles' Blackbird and really kind of spins it in a really moving sort of way and really sort of illustration of what the song was about at the time. Obviously there's hip hop in it, like, and that's, and country music has gone that way too. I mean, how many people could we say, artists, who are incorporating hip hop? I mean, hip hop and country have been bedfellows for many, many years now, but when she does it, everyone has a problem with it. Oh, it makes me so angry. It
Well,
makes me
oh, I agree,
sorry.
it was really interesting because we did a prediction column for the Grammys this last year, and David and I were discussing about the fact that it's not to say, I mean, obviously it's always going to be subjective what the best album is, but I don't know. Whereas there's a real divide in what people believe about whether Lemonade deserved it or not. And you go back to that.
Hmm.
Um, this last year didn't feel like, I mean, I speak in all respect to the others, it didn't feel like a year where there was a runaway album that it was taking away the spotlight from. I mean,
No, not at
it just,
all.
the idea of that being a gimme to her after years of being ignored, I just think is an eye roll.
It's an eye roll and it's so insulting too, and it's just like all of it is just, just so incredibly insulting to her and, and demeaning to her, as someone who works so incredibly hard on her art and in terms of creating everything. So,
I want to roll back to this for our final question because this is more of a fan question. But it'll be a great bonus for people who love her, adore her. The four era. Okay.
Yes.
That has gotten such a bad rap over the years for being lost in all of the other eras, and there's a lot of controversy among the fans. Obviously, nothing to the levels we've talked about prior to, about her making the decision to go with the lead single, "Run the World." Do you think that should have been the lead single to that now that you've like researched
Mm,
each? Because people look at that as like one of her great misfirings because it is radically different from everything
yeah.
else out at the time. And if you look at what she's incorporated into her tour since, it's been other songs from that era, Countdown,
Yeah.
End of Time, which are great. But a lot of people feel like that lead single set a tone that ultimately meant that that era didn't get as much respect as it did. And so I just wanted your 2 cents on that now after looking at all the songs.
It's so fascinating to think about that because, like, on paper, that should have been a perfect first single. In the early, 2011-ish, empowering pop was very popular. And so that was definitely very, girl power, rah rah. And, it's very in character for Beyonce to say something like that. Um, I think the song itself, and I love the song, because I'm, no shade to the song, but it is a weird choice for a single when you think about it, because it's like, the hook isn't necessarily as um easy to digest, I guess, in a sense, if that makes any sense. And a little bit of that, and it felt almost a little bit forced. And I think I could see why that people were like they didn't gravitate toward it because she's done all sorts of empowering songs that feel very natural and very sort of from the heart, and that felt a little bit not that basically. And so I could absolutely see that if she was like, okay, maybe I'll do Love on Top or Countdown first, maybe that would be something, and like Party with Andre 3000, great song, but also like in terms of a single, I think it's funny because when we talk about, the self-titled was the start of, everything, being like not single oriented, you can kind of see that in four, where she, there were some obvious singles, but it was definitely becoming more of an overall album project and less maybe chart oriented. And I guess in hindsight, but I absolutely see that. So I see why people say that. And I would actually agree with that because especially I think, we had things, I'm trying to remember when it came out, but so many albums at that era too lived and died by the first single. That there
Yes.
was, especially because streaming, it was there, but not necessarily as huge there. But, you had a very small window of time to hit. And so if the single didn't hit, and people forget that now. And I think just because, you can hop online and stream anything you want on the day of release, but it was a lot more, the stakes were higher then.
Yes. I'm glad you've joined. I'm Team Countdown. I would have said
I
that
love
would have
that
been the least.
song.
Oh, it's like it's
Yeah.
such a catchy, it's so good, so good. Well, final question could be the most difficult. I don't even know
Oh
if you
no.
can do it because this is hard to do. You've went into such great detail on all of these.
Mhm.
What's your favorite?
Oh my God. My favorite like song
Yes, favorite
era.
one.
Oh my
No, favorite song,
God.
and then the whole book. That because and for everybody out there, I really mean it. This book does such a great job of going into detail. And to her point earlier about just getting into the little details about the songwriting process for each one of
Mhm.
these, and it's just really, really good. But what's the best? If you can even name, I don't know. I don't know if you can narrow it down to one.
So, I mean, so I have I mean, I have many eras and many favorites. I like Radio, which feels like sort of an obscure song, but I like when you kind of read the lyrics and like what the emphasis behind it. I'm like, oh my God, I love that. And so like Radio is was always one of my favorites. Renaissance, like Cuff It. I mean, how can you not love that? And the Break My Soul, I think is great. You know, obviously, Beyonce, the self-titled, I'm looking here, Blow. I really like Blow. And I feel like that's
Oh
sort
yeah,
of
great.
like album track. But I'm the type of person I like the album tracks more than the singles a lot of times, probably because I've heard the singles a million times. Um, but those are, I guess, like just some of my favorites. But there's so many, I mean, we talk about like someone, like Taylor Swift, who has a very consistent catalog. So does Beyonce. She has a lot of songs, but the songs that make the albums are, you can tell why they made the album. Let's put it that way. So those are just like some of my favorites. And of course, Cowboy Carter, like, what are we looking, Bodyguard, of course. So, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, a million. And
well,
it
it could
changes by
be.
the day too.
I agree with you. If you ask me on any random day, it's going to be a different song.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Annie, for taking time to chat with us at 360 today about your book. Beyonce, The Stories Behind the Songs. It's a great one, folks. You need to check it out. It's available now where all books are available. And thanks for everybody for watching. Stay tuned to 360degreesound.com as we continue to bring you coverage of music and music related books from all angles.